Hello, everyone. I know many of you listen while falling asleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. September 16, 2009 started like any ordinary evening in Malibu, California. The Pacific Coast Highway was bathed in the golden glow of sunset, tourists and locals alike enjoying the tail end of summer warmth. Jeffrey's restaurant, perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean, was serving dinner to a modest crowd. The sound of waves crashing against the rocks below created a soothing backdrop to conversations and clinking glasses. It was the kind of evening that postcards are made of, the kind of night where nothing terrible should happen. But something did happen that night. Something that would spark a mystery so confusing, so frustrating, and so heartbreaking that it would haunt the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, a grieving family, and the public consciousness for years to come. Because on that beautiful September evening, a young woman named Mitrice Richardson walked into Joffrey's restaurant, and within hours, she would vanish into the darkness of the Santa Monica Mountains, never to be seen alive again. Mitrice Lavette Richardson was 24 years old when she disappeared. She was beautiful, intelligent, and full of potential. Standing at 5 feet 5 inches tall with a slender build, warm brown eyes, and a radiant smile, Mitrice had the kind of presence that drew people in. She was articulate, thoughtful, and deeply curious about the world around her. Those who knew her described her as a bright light, someone who could walk into a room and immediately make it feel warmer, more alive. Mitrice had grown up in South Los Angeles, raised by her mother Ladis Sutton in a household that valued education, hard work, and perseverance. From an early age, Mitrice showed exceptional promise. She was a gifted student, the kind of child who asked questions that made adults pause and think. She devoured books, excelled in her classes, and dreamed of making a difference in the world. Her mother worked tirelessly to provide opportunities for her daughter, instilling in Mitrice the belief that she could anything she set her mind to. And Mitrice believed it. She attended California State University, Fullerton, where she majored in psychology. She was fascinated by the human mind, by what made people tick, by the invisible forces that shape behavior and emotion. She threw herself into her studies with characteristic passion, earning good grades and building relationships with professors who recognized her potential. Mitrice wasn't just going through the motions of college life. She was genuinely engaged, genuinely excited about her future. But Mitrice was more than just a student. She was an artist, a free spirit who saw the world through a unique lens. She loved poetry and music. She wrote prolifically, filling journals with her thoughts, observations, and creative expressions. She had a philosophical bent, often pondering deep questions about existence, purpose, and human connection. Her friends knew her as someone who could shift effortlessly from light-hearted laughter to profound conversation, someone who felt things deeply and wasn't afraid to explore the complexities of life. In the summer of 2009, Mitrice graduated from Cal State Fullerton with her bachelor's degree in psychology. It was a proud moment for her and her family. Years of hard work had paid off, and the future seemed bright. She had dreams of continuing her education, of perhaps pursuing a graduate degree, of using her knowledge to help others. She talked about becoming a therapist, about working with underserved communities, about making mental health care more accessible to people who looked like her, who came from neighborhoods like hers. After graduation, Mitrice moved to the Los Angeles area, settling in for what she hoped would be the next exciting chapter of her life. She was living in the Baldwin Hills neighborhood, staying with friends while she figured out her next steps. Like many recent graduates, she was in that transitional phase, that space between student life and career, between dependence and full independence. It was a time of possibility but also uncertainty, of excitement mixed with the inevitable stress of figuring out what comes next. Those who saw Mitrice in the weeks and months after graduation noticed that she seemed a bit different. She was still the warm, intelligent person they'd always known. But there was something else there too, something harder to define. She seemed more intense, more scattered at times. Her thoughts would race, jumping from topic to topic in ways that sometimes left friends struggling to keep up. She talked about spiritual awakenings, about cosmic connections, about seeing patterns in the world that others couldn't see. Some friends brushed it off as Mitris being Mitris, just her natural tendency toward philosophical thinking taken to a new level. Others wondered if the stress of post-graduation life was getting to her, if the pressure of uncertainty was manifesting in unusual ways. Her mother, Lattis, noticed the changes too and felt a growing sense of concern. Something seemed off, but Mitris was an adult fiercely independent and resistant to being told what to do or how to feel. In early September 2009, Mitris's behavior became more erratic. She would disappear for hours without explanation, then resurface with stories about spiritual journeys and meaningful encounters with strangers. She talked about messages from the universe, about being on a special path, about having insights that others couldn't understand. Her speech patterns shifted, sometimes rapid and tangential, other times distant and disconnected. Sleep became irregular. Her eating habits changed. To those who knew the signs, it looked like Mitris might be experiencing a mental health crisis, possibly the emergence of a condition like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia. Illnesses that often first manifest in early adulthood. But mental health was still stigmatized in many communities, and getting help wasn't always straightforward. Mitris herself didn't seem to believe anything was wrong. In her mind, she was experiencing an awakening, a spiritual awakening I simply couldn't comprehend. On September 16, 2009, Mitris told friends she was going out for the evening. She didn't specify where she was going or what she planned to do, just that she needed to get out, to clear her head, to experience something. She dressed casually, wore her natural hair in loose curls, and grabbed her belongings. She seemed upbeat, energetic, perhaps a bit more so than usual. No one who saw her leave that day could have imagined that it would be the last time they'd see her alive. Mitris drove her 1995 Honda Civic north from Baldwin Hills, heading toward the coast. Exactly why she chose to drive to Malibu that day remains unclear. She had no apparent connections to the area, no plans to meet anyone, no reservations at any establishment. It was as if she was simply drawn there, pulled by some internal compass that only she could sense. The drive would have taken her through Los Angeles, past the urban sprawl through winding canyon roads, and finally to the pristine coastline where million-dollar homes overlooked the Pacific. By early evening, Mitris arrived at Joffrey's restaurant, a well-known upscale establishment perched dramatically on a cliff above the ocean. Joffrey's was the kind of place where wealthy locals celebrated special occasions, where tourists splurged on meals with unforgettable views. It was elegant, expensive, and not the kind of place a recent college graduate on a tight would typically visit alone without occasion. Mitris walked into Joffrey's sometime around 7:00 p.m. She was alone. She didn't have a reservation. She asked to be seated at the outdoor patio, where she could see the ocean, where she could feel the coastal breeze and watch the sun sink toward the horizon. The hostess accommodated her, leading her to a table with a view. What happened next would be recounted in police reports, witness statements, and eventually in a civil lawsuit that would drag on for years. According to staff members at Joffrey's, Mitris's behavior was immediately unusual. She sat down at her table but seemed distracted, unfocused. When a server approached to take her order, Mitris engaged in conversation that was friendly but somewhat disjointed. She talked about God, about spiritual matters, about the beauty of the setting. The server, accustomed to dealing with all types of customers, took it in stride. Mitris ordered an expensive meal, steak, a salad, drinks. It was the kind of order that would run up a substantial bill, easily over $80 at a high-end restaurant like Joffrey's. She ate slowly, occasionally gazing out at the ocean, sometimes appearing to talk to herself or perhaps to some unseen presence. Other diners noticed her but didn't pay much attention. In a place like Malibu, eccentric behavior wasn't entirely uncommon. As the meal went on, Mitris's demeanor shifted. She became more animated, speaking louder, making statements that drew the attention of nearby tables. She talked about being from Mars, about having special knowledge, about connections to various people and places that seemed random and disconnected. She wasn't aggressive or threatening. but she was clearly not behaving in a typical manner. The staff began to take notice. When it came time to settle her bill, the situation took a dramatic turn. Mitrice didn't have her wallet. She explained that she'd left it in her car, that she could go get it, that there was no problem. But when staff members checked, they found that suspicious. Why would someone order an expensive meal knowing they didn't have their wallet? Why come to a high-end restaurant without the means to pay? Mitrice seemed unconcerned by the growing tension. She continued to talk about spiritual matters, about higher purposes, about how everything would work out. The restaurant staff, now certain they were dealing with someone attempting to dine and dash, or someone experiencing some kind of crisis, made a decision. They called the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. It was approximately 9:00 p.m. when the call went out. A woman at Joffrey's restaurant was refusing to pay her bill and exhibiting bizarre behavior. Deputies from the Malibu Lost Hill station were dispatched to the scene. When Deputy Tarek Farag and his partner arrived at Joffrey's, they found Mitrice still at her table, calm but clearly in an altered state. She greeted the deputies warmly, showing no apparent understanding of the seriousness of the situation. She explained again that her wallet was in her car, that this was all a misunderstanding, that she hadn't intended to cause any trouble. The deputies asked Mitrice to step outside with them. She complied without resistance. They asked for identification, and she provided her driver's license. They asked about the unpaid bill, and she repeated her explanation about the forgotten wallet. The deputies went to Mitrice's car, a 1995 Honda Civic parked in the restaurant's lot. Inside, they could see various personal items, but no wallet, no purse, no visible means of payment. During their interaction with Tress, the deputies noted several red flags. Her speech was rapid and tangential. She made statements that didn't make logical sense. She claimed to be related to various celebrities and public figures, including Michael Jackson, who had died just months earlier. She talked about working for Janet Jackson, about connections to powerful people, about being on a divine mission. Her effect was flat at times, then suddenly animated. To Deputy Farag and his colleagues, the situation was clear. This was a mental health crisis, not a criminal act. Mitrice wasn't violent, she wasn't trying to flee. She was simply a young woman who appeared to be experiencing some kind of psychiatric episode. Under normal circumstances, someone in Mitrice's condition might be taken to a hospital for evaluation, placed on a psychiatric hold, given the help she clearly needed. But that's not what happened. Instead, Deputy Farag made a decision that would haunt him, the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, and Mitrice Richardson's family for years to come. He decided to arrest Mitrice for the unpaid restaurant bill. She was handcuffed, read her rights, and placed in the back of a patrol car. Her vehicle was impounded. Her belongings were cataloged, and Mitrice Richardson, a 24-year-old woman clearly in crisis, was taken to the Lost Hills Sheriff's Station to be booked on suspicion of defrauding an innkeeper and possession of marijuana, which deputies had found a small amount of in her car. At the station, Mitrice was processed. Her personal information was recorded. Her belongings were inventoried: no wallet, no money, no cell phone that was charged and working. The marijuana was noted in the report. She was placed in a holding cell, where she would remain for the next several hours. During her time in custody, Mitrice's unusual behavior continued. She talked to herself, made grandiose statements, and seemed disconnected from reality. Officers at the station could clearly see that something was wrong with her. Some later testified that they believed she was experiencing a mental health crisis. Some said they thought she might be under the influence of drugs, though no evidence of drug use beyond the small amount of marijuana was ever found. At one point during her detention, Mitrice asked to make a phone call. She was allowed to use the phone, but the call went unanswered. Her mother, Lotus, was at home in Los Angeles, unaware that her daughter had been arrested, unaware that Mitrice was sitting in a jail cell in Malibu exhibiting signs of a serious psychiatric crisis. The hours ticked by, midnight came and went. Mitrice remained in her cell waiting. The deputies on duty at Lost Hill Station had a decision to make. Technically, Mitrice could be held until she appeared before a judge, which wouldn't happen until the next business day. But the charge against her was relatively minor. The restaurant had been paid by the sheriff's department using funds from Mitrice's impounded vehicle. She wasn't a flight risk. She wasn't violent. Around 20:15 a.m. on September 17, 2009, a decision was made. Mitrice Richardson would be released from custody. But there was a problem. Actually, several problems. Mies had no money. Her car had been impounded and was miles away at a tow yard. Her cell phone was dead. She had no jacket. And the temperature in the Santa Monica Mountains at night in mid-September could drop significantly. And most critically, she was clearly in the midst of a mental health crisis, exhibiting behavior that suggested she was not capable of making sound decisions about her own safety. Standard protocol in such situations would typically involve several safeguards. Family members could be called to pick up the person being released. A mental health evaluation could be conducted. At minimum, release would occur during daylight hours, when the person being released would have a better chance of finding help or transportation. In cases where someone was released in an area as remote as Lost Hill Station, which sits in a sparsely populated area surrounded by mountains and canyons, extra care would normally be taken. None of that happened with Mitrice Richardson. At approximately 12:38 a.m., according to official records, Mitrice Richardson walked out of the Lost Hills Sheriff's Station into the darkness of the Santa Monica Mountains. She was alone on foot, with no money, no phone, no vehicle, and no clear sense of where she was or how to get home. The nearest businesses were miles away. The nearest populated area was a significant distance down dark, winding roads with no sidewalks and minimal lighting. The mountains around the station were vast, rugged, and potentially dangerous, especially at night. Deputy Tariq Farag, who had arrested Mitrice earlier that evening, was present when she was released. He would later testify that he offered to call someone for her, that he asked if she had anyone who could pick her up. According to his account, Mitrice declined, saying she would be fine, that she would find her way. Other deputies present that night told similar stories, painting a picture of a woman who seemed confident in her ability to navigate the situation. But those who would later review the case raised obvious questions. If Mitrice was clearly experiencing a mental health crisis, as multiple officers acknowledged, how could her refusal to help be taken at face value? If she was making grandiose, delusional statements about being related to celebrities and being on divine missions, how could her judgment about her own safety be trusted? Why would trained law enforcement officers release a vulnerable young woman into a dangerous situation in the middle of the night? The answers to those questions would never be satisfying. Mitrice walked out of the station and turned left, heading south on Malibu Canyon Road. Security cameras at the station captured her leaving, a solitary figure in the darkness, walking with purpose but toward an uncertain destination. She was wearing the same clothes she'd been arrested in, dark pants and a shirt, inadequate for the dropping temperature. And then, Mitrice Richardson disappeared. The last confirmed sighting of her was at 12:38 a.m. on September 17, 2009, walking away from the Lost Hills Sheriff's Station. After that, she simply vanished. No one saw her hitchhiking. No one reported picking her up. No security cameras in the area captured her image. She didn't call anyone. She didn't show up at any businesses or homes asking for help. It was as if she had walked into the night and been swallowed whole by the darkness. For several hours, no one knew Mitrice was missing. Her mother, Lattice, was at home, still unaware of the arrest. Friends who might have expected to hear from Mitrice weren't alarmed yet. It wasn't unusual for her to be out of contact for or two given her recent behavior. The sheriff's department, having released her, considered the matter closed. It wasn't until later in the day on September 17 that Lattice Sutton began to worry. She tried calling Mitrice's cell phone, but it went straight to voicemail. She reached out to friends, asking if anyone had seen or heard from her daughter. No one had. A creeping sense of dread began to settle over Lattice, a mother's intuition that something was terribly wrong. By the evening of September 17th, Lattice was actively searching for her daughter. She called hospitals, checked with friends, retraced Mitrice's recent movements. Finally, she learned that Mitrice's car had been impounded in Malibu. The pieces started pounding together, but they formed a picture that made no sense. Why had Mitrice been in Malibu? Why had her car been impounded? Where was she now? Lattice called the Lost Hills Sheriff Station, desperate for information. The conversation she had with the deputy who answered would later become a point of significant controversy. According to Lattice's account, she was told that Mitris had been arrested but had been released. When Lattice asked what time Mitris had been released, she was told it was in the middle of the night. When she asked if anyone had made sure Mitris had a safe way to get home, the answers were vague and unsatisfying. Lattice Sutton felt her heart drop. Her daughter, who had been showing signs of a mental health crisis, who had no money or phone or vehicle, had been released into the wilderness in the middle of the night. And now she was missing. On September 18, 2009, Lattice Sutton filed a missing persons report with the Los Angeles Police Department. She provided them with all the information she had: Mitris's arrest in Malibu, her release from Lost Hills Station in the early morning hours of September 17th, and her subsequent disappearance. She described her daughter's recent behavioral changes, her concerns about Mitris's mental state, and her fear that Mitris was in serious danger. The LAPD forwarded the information to the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, which had jurisdiction over the area where Mitris was last seen. And that's when something truly disturbing happened. Instead of immediately launching a search operation, instead of treating this as an urgent missing persons case involving a vulnerable individual last seen in their custody, the Sheriff's Department response was minimal at best. Days passed. Then a week. Then 2 weeks. Mitris Richardson was still missing, and the search efforts were shockingly inadequate. There were no press conferences, no public appeals for information, no large-scale search operations in the mountains and canyons around Lost Hills Station. When Lattice pushed for answers, she was told that Mitris was an adult who had left the station of her own free will, that there was no evidence of foul play, that she had probably just wandered off and would turn up eventually. But Mitris didn't turn up. Not at friends' houses, not at hospitals, not anywhere. It was as if she had ceased to exist the moment she walked out of that sheriff's station. Frustrated and terrified, Lattice Sutton took matters into her own hands. She contacted the media, telling Mitris's story to anyone who would listen. She organized volunteer search parties, recruiting friends, family, and concerned community members to calm the areas around where Mitris was last seen. She created flyers with Mitris's photo, distributing them throughout Malibu and the surrounding areas. She hired a private investigator. She did everything a desperate mother could do to find her missing child. The media coverage began to build. Local news stations picked up the story, drawn by the disturbing details and the apparent failures of the sheriff's department. Questions were raised about why a young woman in clear mental distress had been released in such dangerous circumstances. Questions were asked about why the search response had been so inadequate. And questions were raised about whether Mitris's race had played a role in how her case was handled. Because Mitris Richardson was a young black woman, and there was a painful history of missing black women and girls not receiving the same level of attention or resources as missing white women. Lattice Sutton and her advocates pointed out that if a young white woman from a wealthy family had been released in the same circumstances and then disappeared, the response would have been swift and massive. But Mitris's case had been treated as an afterthought, a low priority, a situation that would probably resolve itself. As September turned into October, the pressure on the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department mounted. They were forced to acknowledge publicly that perhaps their handling of Mitris's case had been inadequate. They announced that they were increasing search efforts, bringing in additional resources, and taking the matter seriously. But by then, it had been weeks since Mitris disappeared. If she had been injured or lost in the mountains that first night, if she had needed immediate rescue, that opportunity was long gone. The chances of finding her alive diminished with each passing day. Search teams began to systematically comb the rugged terrain around Lost Hills Station. The Santa Monica Mountains are vast and unforgiving, filled with steep canyons, dense vegetation, and areas that are difficult to access even for experienced hikers in daylight. At night, in a state of mental confusion, without proper equipment or knowledge of the area, a person could easily become lost, injured, or worse, Helicopters flew overhead, searching for any sign of Mitrice. Ground teams on foot and horseback covered miles of trails and backcountry. Search dogs were brought in, attempting to catch Mitrice's scent. Volunteers joined professional search and rescue teams, all hoping for a miracle, all hoping to find Mitrice alive. But the mountains yielded no answers. Days of searching turned up nothing. No clothing, no personal items, no trace of Mitrice Richardson. It was as if she had simply evaporated. Theories began to circulate. Some believed Mitrice had wandered into the mountains and succumbed to exposure or injury. Others wondered if she had been picked up by someone, either a good Samaritan who failed to come forward or someone with malicious intent. There were rumors of sightings, reports of a young black woman matching Mitrice's description seen in various locations around Malibu and Los Angeles, but none of them panned out. Ladis Sutton refused to give up hope. She appeared on television, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. She spoke at community meetings, church gatherings, anywhere she could share her daughter's story. She maintained that Mitrice was a victim, that the system had failed her, and that someone, somewhere, knew something about what had happened to her daughter. The sheriff's department, meanwhile, began to face intense scrutiny not just for their handling of Mitrice's disappearance, but for their actions on the night of her arrest and release. Internal reviews were launched. Questions were asked about departmental policies regarding the release of individuals who appeared to be in mental health crisis. Deputy Tariq Farag, who had arrested Mitrice, found himself at the center of a growing controversy. As October gave way to November, the active search efforts began to wind down. The official position was that search teams had covered all the most likely areas, and that continued intensive searching was unlikely to yield results. But they promised that the case remained open, that any new leads would be pursued, that Mitrice Richardson had not been forgotten. For Ladis Sutton, those promises rang hollow. Her daughter was still missing. The people responsible for releasing her into danger had faced no consequences. And the media, which had briefly shone a spotlight on Mitrice's case, was already moving on to the next story. Winter arrived, bringing rain to the mountains. The terrain became even more difficult to search. Ladis continued her private search efforts, but the task was overwhelming. The Santa Monica Mountains encompass nearly 500 square miles of rugged wilderness. Finding one person in that vast expanse, especially after so much time had passed, was like looking for a needle in a haystack. As 2009 turned into 2010, Mitrice Richardson had been missing for nearly 4 months. Her case had generated significant media attention and public outrage, but no real answers. Where was Mitrice? What had happened to her after she walked out of Lost Hill Station? Was she still alive somewhere, unable or unwilling to come home? Or had she met a tragic end in those dark mountains? The questions haunted everyone who knew her story. And the answers, when they finally came, would be devastating. The winter months of 2009 and early 2010 were agonizing for Ladis Sutton. Every day that passed without word from Mitrice felt like a small death, a piece of hope eroding away. Ladis maintained her vigil, continuing to search, continuing to push law enforcement for answers, continuing to keep her daughter's name in the public consciousness. She couldn't accept that Mitrice was simply gone, that her bright, beautiful daughter had vanished without a trace. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, under mounting pressure from the media and civil rights organizations, maintained that they were doing everything possible to locate Mitrice. They released statements assuring the public that the case was a priority, that investigators were following every lead, that they remained committed to finding answers. But behind the scenes, there was little active investigation happening. The trail had gone cold almost immediately, and without new evidence or credible sightings, there was nowhere for investigators to go. Ladis wasn't satisfied with these assurances. She began to dig deeper into the circumstances of Mitrice's arrest and release, filing public records requests and demanding to see documentation of exactly what had happened that night. What she discovered only deepened her anger and suspicion. The arrest report showed that deputies had clearly documented Mitrice's bizarre behavior, her disconnected statements, her apparent mental health crisis. Yet despite recognizing these red flags, they had still released her into the night with no support, no follow-up, No safety net. Even more disturbing, Lattice learned that Sheriff's Department policy actually discouraged releasing individuals late at night, particularly in remote locations, particularly when those individuals had no means of transportation. The policy recommended that people arrested for minor offenses either be held until morning or be released to a responsible party. Neither of these protocols had been followed in Mitress's case. Why? That question burned in Lattice's mind. Why had her daughter been treated so carelessly? Why had the rules been bent or broken? Was it simple negligence, or was there something more sinister at play? Some members of the community began to whisper about darker possibilities. Rumors circulated that Mitress hadn't simply wandered off into the mountains, that something had happened to her while in custody, or shortly after her release. There were suggestions that perhaps a deputy or someone connected to law enforcement had been involved in her disappearance. These theories were based more on suspicion than evidence, but they gained traction in communities that had long-standing distrust of law enforcement. The Sheriff's Department vehemently denied any wrongdoing, beyond the admittedly flawed decision to release Mitress when they did. They maintained that security cameras and logs showed Mitress leaving the station alone, that no deputies had followed her, that there was no evidence of any criminal conduct by their personnel. But the denials did little to quell the growing chorus of criticism. In January 2010, Lattice Sutton hired a prominent civil right to explore legal options. She wanted accountability. She wanted answers. And she wanted to make sure that what happened to Mitress never happened to anyone else's child. The attorney began building a case for a civil rights lawsuit against the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, alleging that their negligent release of Mitress had directly led to her disappearance and probable death. Meanwhile, the search for Mitress continued in fits and starts. Volunteer groups organized periodic searches of the mountains, focusing on areas that hadn't been thoroughly covered in the initial search operations. Private investigators hired by the family pursued various leads, interviewing people who lived and worked near Lost Hill Station, checking with homeless encampments in the area, following up on reported sightings that invariably turned out to be cases of mistaken identity. February came and went. March. Mitress had been missing for 6 months. The media coverage, which had been substantial in the first weeks after her disappearance, had dwindled to occasional updates. The public's attention had moved on to other tragedies, other mysteries. But for Lattice and those who loved Mitress, time had stopped on that September night when her daughter walked out of the Lost Hill Station. Lattice refused to hold a memorial service. To do so would be to accept that Mitress was dead, and she wasn't ready to accept that. She clung to the possibility, however slim, that Mitress was alive somewhere. Maybe she had experienced a complete mental breakdown and was living on the streets under a different identity. Maybe she had been taken in by someone and was being held against her will. Maybe she had amnesia and didn't know who she was or how to get home. These scenarios seemed far-fetched, but they were better than the alternative. The alternative was that Mitress had died that first night, alone and confused in the dark mountains, and that her body lay somewhere in the vast wilderness, waiting to be found. As spring arrived in 2010, bringing wildflowers and new growth to the Santa Monica Mountains, something else emerged from the earth. Something that would finally provide an answer to the question of what happened to Mitress Richardson, even as it raised a dozen new questions that would prove just as difficult to answer. On August 9, 2010, nearly 11 months after Mitress disappeared, a park ranger was conducting a routine patrol in a remote area of Manitou, a community in the Santa Monica Mountains. The area was rugged and sparsely populated, known more for hiking trails and wildlife than human habitation. The ranger was walking through a canyon area thick with vegetation when something caught his eye. At first, it looked like scattered debris, the kind of trash that sometimes accumulates in wild areas despite efforts to keep them pristine. But as the ranger moved closer, his stomach dropped. What he was looking at wasn't trash. It was human remains. The ranger immediately called for backup and secured the area. Within hours, the scene was swarming with investigators from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, forensic technicians and medical examiner personnel. The remains were clearly old, having been exposed to the elements for a significant period of time. They were partially skeletal, scattered across a small area likely by animal activity. The location where the remains were found was shocking. It was in a creek bed in Dark Canyon, an area of Monte Nido roughly 6 miles from the Lost Hills Sheriff Station. But that 6-mile distance was deceptive. The terrain between the station and this location was extremely rugged, involving steep climbs, dense brush, and multiple canyons. For someone to walk from the station to this location at night, in a state of mental confusion, without proper equipment or knowledge of the area, would have been extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. Even more shocking was that this area had supposedly been searched in the initial search operations back in September and October 2009. According to Sheriff's Department records, search teams had covered this general vicinity. The question that immediately arose was, how had they missed a body? The remains were carefully collected and transported to the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's office. Identification would require forensic analysis, but investigators had a strong suspicion about whose body they had found. The location, the timing, the fact that there were no other recent missing persons cases that fit the profile. Everything pointed to one conclusion. On August 11, 2010, the medical examiner's office confirmed what everyone feared. Through dental records, the remains found in Dark Canyon were positively identified as those of Mitrice Lavette Richardson. The notification call to Lattice Sutton came on a summer afternoon. She had been expecting this call for 11 months, dreading it, preparing herself for it, and yet when it finally came, nothing prepared her for the reality of it. Her daughter was dead. Mitrice had been dead, probably from that very first night, lying in a canyon while Lattice searched desperately for her. While she appeared on television pleading for her return, while she held on to hope that Mitrice would come home. The grief was overwhelming. But close behind the grief came anger, questions, and a determination to understand exactly what had happened to her daughter. Because while the discovery of Mitrice's remains her, the question of whether she was alive, it opened up a Pandora's box of new questions that the sheriff's department seemed ill-equipped or unwilling to answer. How did Mitrice get from Lost Hills Station to Dark Canyon? Why was her body found 6 miles away in such difficult terrain? How had search teams missed her body during the initial search operations? What was the cause of death? Had she died of exposure, injury, or something else? Were there any signs of foul play? The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department scheduled a press conference for August 12, 2010 to address the discovery. Sheriff Lee Baca himself appeared, flanked by homicide investigators and department spokespersons. The atmosphere was tense. The media room was packed with reporters who had covered Mitrice's disappearance and now wanted answers about her death. Sheriff Baca began by expressing condolences to the Richardson family. He confirmed that the remains found in Dark Canyon had been identified as Mitrice Richardson. He stated that the medical examiner was conducting a thorough autopsy to determine the cause and manner of death. And then he said something that stunned everyone in the room. According to Sheriff Baca, there was no evidence of foul play. The preliminary assessment was that Mitrice had walked into the mountains after her release from Lost Hill Station and had died of exposure or injury. It was a tragic accident, he said, but not a crime. The department stood by their personnel in their handling of the case, with the exception of acknowledging that perhaps Mitrice should not have been released in the middle of the night. The response from Mitrice's family and their attorneys was immediate and fierce. How could the sheriff's department possibly claim there was no foul play when the investigation had barely begun? How could they make any determinations about cause of death before the autopsy was complete? And how could they absolve themselves of responsibility when their actions had directly put Mitrice in the situation that led to her death? Lattice Sutton, speaking to reporters outside the press conference, was clear in her position. "They killed my daughter," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Maybe they didn't put their hands on her directly, but they put her in a situation where she couldn't survive. They knew she was in crisis. They knew she had no way to get home. And they pushed her out the door anyway. That's not an accident. That's negligence, and someone needs to be held accountable." The autopsy of Mitris Richardson's remains was conducted by the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner's Office over the following weeks. Given the condition of the remains and the amount of time that had passed since death, determining an exact cause of death would be challenging. But the medical examiner's office promised a thorough and careful analysis. The results, when they were released, were frustrating in their lack of clarity. The official cause of death was listed as undetermined. The medical examiner could not definitively say what had caused Mitris's death. There were no signs of obvious trauma to the bones, no evidence of gunshot wounds or blunt force injuries that would have left marks on skeletal remains. There was no way to test for drugs or toxins given the decomposition. There were no soft tissues remaining that could show signs of strangulation or suffocation. The manner of death was listed as undetermined as well. This meant the medical examiner could not say whether Mitris's death was accidental, natural, a suicide, or a homicide. All options remained on the table. Though the medical examiner's report did note that the circumstances and location of the remains were consistent with someone who became lost in the wilderness and succumbed to the elements. For the sheriff's department, this autopsy report was validation of their position. They interpreted undetermined as essentially ruling out foul play. They maintained that Mitris had simply gotten lost and died of exposure, a tragic but straightforward explanation. For Lattice Sutton and her legal team, the undetermined finding meant that nothing had been ruled out. They argued that the absence of evidence was not the same as evidence of absence. Just because the medical examiner couldn't prove foul play didn't mean it hadn't occurred. And even if Mitris had died of exposure, that didn't absolve the sheriff's department of responsibility for putting her in that situation. But beyond the cause and manner of death, there were other details in the autopsy report and the investigation findings that raised serious questions. These details would fuel conspiracy theories and alternative narratives about what really happened to Mitris Richardson for years to come. First, there was the question of Mitris's clothing. When she was released from Lost Hill Station, she was wearing dark pants and a shirt. When her remains were found, she was reported found completely nude. Where were her clothes? Why would someone dying of exposure remove their clothing? While it's true that victims of severe hypothermia sometimes experience paradoxical undressing, a phenomenon where they feel hot and remove their clothes in the final stages of freezing to death, the circumstances here didn't quite fit that explanation. The temperature the night Mitris disappeared had been cool but not freezing, probably in the 50s Fahrenheit. Was paradoxical undressing really likely in those conditions? Second, there was the location itself. Dark Canyon was not a place someone would naturally walk to from Lost Hill Station. Especially at night, there was no direct path, no road, no trail that led obviously from one location to the other. Getting to Dark Canyon from the station would have required navigating through extremely rugged terrain, crossing through multiple properties, traversing steep hillsides and thick vegetation. Doing this in daylight would be challenging for an experienced hiker. Doing it at night, in a state of mental distress, seemed nearly impossible. Some investigators theorized that Mitris might have been picked up by someone after leaving the station, driven to the area where she was found, and then either abandoned there or worse. This would explain how she ended up so far from the station in such an unlikely location. But there was no evidence to support this theory. No witnesses reported Mitris get into a vehicle. No one came forward claiming to have given her a ride. And if someone had picked her up with malicious intent, why would they drive her to such a remote location only to leave her there rather than killing her and disposing of the body elsewhere? Third, there was the troubling question of the initial search. The sheriff's department had claimed they searched the area where Mitris was found during the first weeks after her disappearance. Search and rescue teams had supposedly covered Dark Canyon and the surrounding areas, yet they had missed her body. How was that possible? The sheriff's department offered several explanations. They said the terrain was extremely dense with vegetation, that the body could have been hidden in the underbrush and easily overlooked. They doubted that Mitris's remains were found in a creek bed, and that runoff and animal activity might have scattered the remains over time, making them harder to spot. They acknowledged that the initial search had been hampered by limited resources and the vast size of the search area. But critics pointed out that if the search teams had been properly equipped and properly motivated, they should have found her. Search and rescue operations use grid patterns, scent dogs, and systematic approaches specifically to avoid missing areas. The fact that Mitriss's body had been lying in a supposedly searched area for 11 months was either evidence of incompetence or evidence that the sheriff's department hadn't searched as thoroughly as they claimed. Fourth, there were Mitriss's personal items. When her remains were found, investigators located some of her belongings in the area, but not everything. Her clothing was never found. Some items that should have been with her, based on what she had when she was released from custody, were missing. Where had these items gone? Had someone taken them? Had they been scattered by animals? Or had Mitrice never had them in the first place, suggesting she hadn't walked to this location on her own? As these questions multiplied, alternative theories about Mitriss's death began to proliferate. Some people believed she had been murdered by someone who picked her up after her release, possibly someone connected to law enforcement who wanted to cover up their involvement. Others thought she might have been held somewhere for a period of time before her death, which would explain why her body wasn't found immediately. Still others suggested that she had died at or near the sheriff's station and her body had been moved to Dark Canyon to make it look like she had wandered off. These theories ranged from plausible to wildly speculative, but they all shared a common thread: a deep distrust of the official narrative being promoted by the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. That distrust was rooted in the department's handling of the case from the beginning. From the decision to release Mitrice in dangerous circumstances, to the inadequate initial search, to the premature conclusions about the cause of death, the Sheriff's Department, for its part, dismissed the conspiracy theories as unfounded speculation. They maintained that while mistakes had been made, specifically the decision to release Mitrice when they did, there was no evidence of any criminal wrongdoing by their personnel. They characterized the alternative theories as the product of grief and mistrust rather than facts. But the department's credibility was severely damaged, and not just in the eyes of Mitriss's family and advocates. The Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors launched an independent investigation into the Sheriff's Department's handling of the case. Civil rights organizations called for federal oversight, and the media continued to scrutinize every aspect of the case, finding new questions with each new revelation. In late 2010, Lattice Sutton formally filed a civil lawsuit against Los Angeles County, the Sheriff's Department, and several individual deputies, including Deputy Tarek Farag, who had arrested Mitrice. The lawsuit alleged civil rights violations, wrongful death, negligence, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. It sought damages and, perhaps more importantly, public accountability for what had happened to Mitrice. The lawsuit laid out a damning narrative. It described how Mitrice had been experiencing a clear mental health crisis, how deputies had recognized this crisis, and how they had nevertheless arrested her for a minor offense rather than getting her the help she needed. It detailed how she had been released in the middle of the night with no money, no phone, no transportation, and no plan for how to get home safely. It argued that the Sheriff's Department's actions had directly caused Mitrice's death, and that their subsequent investigation had been inadequate and potentially deliberately misleading. The defense, representing the Sheriff's Department, argued that while the decision to release Mitrice when they did might have been unwise, it wasn't illegal. They contended that Mitrice was an adult who had chosen to leave the station, that deputies had offered to call someone for her, and she had declined, and that what happened to her after she left was not their legal responsibility. They maintained that there was no evidence their personnel had done anything criminal, and that the lawsuit was an attempt to blame them for a tragic but unforeseeable accident. The legal battle would drag on for years, with both sides presenting evidence, deposing witnesses, and arguing over every detail of what happened that September night, and in the months that followed. The case would become a focal point for larger conversations about police accountability, mental health crisis intervention, and the treatment of people of color in the criminal justice system. But while the lawyers argued in courtrooms, the questions about what really happened to Mitrice Richardson remained unanswered. How did she get to Dark Canyon? What were her last hours like? Did she die that first night, or did she survive for days in the wilderness? Was she alone, or was someone else involved? Did she suffer, or was her death quick? These were the questions that haunted Lattice Sutton. She had her daughter's remains now, and in January 2011, she finally held the memorial service she had postponed for so long. Friends, family, and supporters gathered to celebrate Mitrice's life, to mourn her death, and to vow that they would continue fighting for justice in her name. Mitrice was buried in a private ceremony. Lattice placed photos of Mitrice as a child, as a teenager, as a college graduate in the casket with her. She included some of Mitrice's journals, her poetry, the written expressions of the brilliant mind that had been lost too soon. And she made a promise to her daughter she would not stop until everyone knew Mitrice's name, until everyone understood what had been done to her, and until someone was held accountable. As 2011 progressed, new information continued to trickle out about the case. Some of it came through the civil lawsuit discovery process, as Lattice's attorneys obtained documents and deposed Sheriff's Department personnel. Some came from independent journalists who investigated various aspects of the case. And some came from people who had been afraid to speak out initially, but who felt compelled to share what they knew as time passed. One particularly interesting piece of information came from a man named Bill McCabe, who lived in the Monte Nido area near where Mitrice's body was found. McCabe came forward in late 2010 to report that on the morning of September 17, 2009, the day after Mitrice was released from custody, he had seen a young black woman matching Mitrice's description in his neighborhood. According to McCabe, he was outside him around 6:00 or 7:00 a.m. when he noticed a woman walking on the road. She appeared disoriented and was mumbling to herself. She was in an area that was largely residential, populated by expensive homes with large properties. It was unusual to see someone walking there, especially someone who appeared to be in distress. McCabe said he briefly considered approaching the woman to ask if she needed help, but something about the situation made him hesitate. He watched her for a few moments, then went inside his home. When he came back outside a short time later, she was gone. He didn't think much of it at the time and didn't report it to anyone. It wasn't until months later, after Mitrice's body was found not far from his property, that McCabe made the connection. He realized that the woman he had seen that morning was probably Mitrice Richardson. He was haunted by the fact that he hadn't helped her, that he had been one of the last people to see her alive and had done nothing. McCabe's account, if accurate, was significant for several reasons. First, it meant that Mitrice had survived the night and was still alive the morning after her release. This was important because it suggested she hadn't immediately succumbed to exposure or injury, but had actually made it through the dark hours and into daylight. Second, it placed her in the Monte Nido area relatively early in the morning, which meant she had somehow traveled the 6 miles from Lost Hill Station to Dark Canyon during the night. This supported the theory that she had walked there, though it still didn't explain how she had navigated the difficult terrain in the dark. Third, and perhaps most tragically, it meant that if McCabe had approached Mitrice and offered help, if he had called police or emergency services, she might still be alive. This was a thought that clearly tormented McCabe, and it was a reminder of how many small moments and decisions had contributed to Mitrice's death. The Sheriff's Department incorporated McCabe's account into their official narrative. They now said that Mitrice had walked from Lost Hill Station through the night, somehow making her way to Monte Nido, where she had been seen by McCabe. After that sighting, she had continued to wander, eventually making her way into Dark Canyon, where she had collapsed and died, possibly later that same day or in the days immediately following. This narrative, the department argued, was consistent with all the known facts. It explained how Mitrice got to where she was found. It accounted for her being alive the morning after her release, and it supported the conclusion that her death was accidental, the result of exposure, dehydration, and possibly injuries sustained while traversing difficult terrain in a state of mental confusion. But Lattice Sutton and her attorneys weren't convinced. They pointed out significant problems with this narrative. If Mitrice had been alive and walking around Monte Nido at 6000 or 7000 a.m., why hadn't she sought help? The area where McCabe saw her was residential, with numerous homes. Why hadn't she knocked on a door or approached someone, asked to use a phone? Even in a state of mental crisis, basic survival instincts should have driven her to seek assistance. Moreover, if Mitrice had survived until daylight and was in a populated area, how had she ended up dead in a remote canyon? The location where her body was found was not somewhere a person would naturally wander to. It required leaving the road, entering private property, and descending into a canyon area with no clear path. Why would she have done that? Some alternative theories suggested that perhaps Mitrice had sought help at one of the homes in the area and had been turned away, or worse, had encountered someone who had harmed her. There were rumors, unsubstantiated but persistent, that Mitrice had been seen on security cameras at certain properties in Monte Nido, that she had knocked on doors, and that someone knew more than they were saying about her final hours. The sheriff's department investigated these rumors, but claimed to find no evidence supporting them. They said they had canvassed the neighborhood, interviewed residents, and checked security cameras, but had found nothing beyond McCabe's sighting. As the investigation continued, more witnesses came forward with potential sightings of Mitrice in the hours and days after her release. Some of these accounts were credible, corroborated by multiple witnesses or physical evidence. Others were more dubious, possibly cases of mistaken identity or people seeking attention in a high-profile case. But each account added another piece to the puzzle, even if the pieces didn't always fit together neatly. A woman named Wendy Howard reported that she had seen someone matching Mitrice's description on the morning of September 10th walking along Malibu Canyon Road, not far from Lost Hills Station. According to Howard, the woman appeared to be in distress, walking erratically and talking to herself. Howard had been driving and hadn't stopped, but the image had stuck with her. When she later saw news reports about Mitrice's disappearance, she was convinced it had been the missing woman she'd seen. This sighting, if accurate, suggested that Mitrice had initially walked south from the sheriff's station, which would have been a logical direction if she was trying to make her way back toward Los Angeles. But at some point, she must have changed direction or been taken somewhere else, because she ended up miles away in Dark Canyon. Another witness, whose name was not publicly released, told investigators that they had seen a young black woman on the property of a prominent resident in the Monte Nido area on the morning of September 17th. According to this account, the woman was near a guest house or outbuilding, appeared confused, and left when approached. The property owner, when questioned by investigators, denied any knowledge of this incident and said no one matching Mitrice's description had been on their property. These conflicting accounts created more confusion than clarity. Were people actually seeing Mitrice, or were they seeing someone else and later convincing themselves it had been her? Were some witnesses lying or misremembering details? Or were there genuine sightings that the sheriff's department was failing to properly investigate? The lack of physical evidence from the scene where Mitrice's body was found compounded the uncertainty. Because the remains had been exposed to the elements for 11 months, and because they had been disturbed by animal activity, the forensic evidence was limited. There were no footprints to analyze, no fresh DNA evidence beyond Mitrice's own remains, no smoking gun that could definitively explain what had happened. What investigators did find at the scene were as many questions as it answered. Mitrice's remains were scattered across a small area, consistent with animal scavenging. Some bones were missing entirely, likely carried off by coyotes or other predators. The skull was found partially buried in creek sediment. There were no obvious signs of trauma to the bones, but subtle fractures or injury had been obscured by the decomposition and scattering. The absence of Mitrice's clothing was particularly vexing to investigators. A thorough search of the area turned up no fabric, no shoes, no undergarments. Nothing that Mitrice would have been wearing when she left the sheriff's station. while it was possible that clothing had been completely consumed by decomposition or carried away by animals. This seemed unlikely given that some of Mitriss's other personal items were recovered nearby. Some of Mitriss's jewelry was found near the remains, which seemed to argue against a robbery motive if foul play was involved. But other items that should have been with her were missing. Her driver's license, which she'd had when arrested, was never found. Neither was a small amount of cash that had been logged when she was booked and should have been returned to her upon release. The question of how thoroughly the area had been searched initially became a major point of contention. The sheriff's department released maps and logs showing the areas that search teams had covered in September and October 2009. According to these documents, Dark Canyon and the surrounding area had been searched multiple times by both ground teams and helicopters. But when independent analysts reviewed these search records, they found significant discrepancies. Some areas marked as searched had only been viewed from a distance or from the air, not actually traversed by ground teams. Some searches had been conducted during conditions that made finding a body extremely difficult, such as during heavy rain or in dense fog. And some areas appeared to have been missed entirely despite being relatively close to where Mitrice was last seen. The use of search dogs in the initial investigation also came under scrutiny. Cadaver dogs and tracking dogs had been deployed, but their effectiveness had been limited by several factors. The trail was already cold by the time the dogs were brought in, days after Mitrice's disappearance. The rugged terrain and dense vegetation made it difficult for the dogs to cover large areas efficiently, and there were questions about whether the dogs had been given proper scent articles to track Mitrice's specific scent. In one particularly troubling revelation, it came to light that search teams had been within a few hundred yards of where Mitrice's body was eventually found during the initial search operations. They had been close enough that if she had been able to call out, if she had still been alive, they might have heard her. But the search had moved on to other areas without discovering her. This revelation devastated Lattice Sutton. The thought that her daughter might have been lying injured and alive while rescuers walked nearby, that Mitrice might have spent her final hours hoping someone would find her, was almost too much to bear. It reinforced Lattice's belief that the sheriff's department had failed her daughter at every turn, from the moment of her arrest to the inadequate search that followed her disappearance. The civil lawsuit continued to move through the courts, with both sides presenting expert witnesses and competing narratives of what had happened. Lattice's legal team brought in experts in search and rescue operations who testified that the initial search had been inadequate and poorly executed. They presented experts in mental health crisis intervention who testified that Mitrice should never have been released in the condition she was in, and that the deputies who interacted with her should have recognized she needed psychiatric evaluation and treatment, not arrest and detention. The defense countered with their own experts who argued that the search had been reasonable given the circumstances and the vast area involved. They presented testimony suggesting that even a perfect search might have missed Mitrice's body given the difficult terrain and the condition of the remains. And they argued that while the deputy's decision to release Mitrice might have been questionable, it didn't rise to the level of a constitutional violation or gross negligence. During depositions, several sheriff's department personnel were questioned extensively about their actions and decisions that night. Deputy Tariq Farad, who had arrested Mitrice, was asked repeatedly why he hadn't taken her to a hospital for psychiatric evaluation instead of arresting her for a minor offense. His answer was that he believed she was under the influence of drugs rather than experiencing a mental health crisis, though no evidence of drug use beyond marijuana was ever found. Farag was also asked about the decision to release Mitrice in the middle of the night. He testified that he had offered to call someone for her, that she had declined, and that he didn't have the legal authority to hold her against her, once she had been processed. He maintained that he had acted in accordance with department policies, and that he regretted what happened, but didn't believe he had done anything wrong. Other deputies who were present at the Lost Hill station the night Mitrice was released gave similar testimony. They acknowledged that Mitrice had been acting strangely, that they had concerns about her mental state, but that ultimately she was an adult who had the right to leave once she was released from custody. Several deputies said they had assumed Mitrice would walk to a nearby gas station or business and call someone to pick her up, that they never imagined she would walk off into the wilderness. But this assumption was questioned by Lattice's attorneys. The nearest gas station or business was miles away from Lost Hill Station, down a dark road with no sidewalks and no street lights. For the deputies to assume that a woman in mental crisis would successfully navigate that walk in the middle of the night, without money or a phone, seemed incredibly naive at best and criminally negligent at worst. The culture within the sheriff's department also came under examination during the lawsuit. Evidence emerged of a pattern of poor decision-making and lack of accountability within the department. This wasn't the first time someone had been released from custody in questionable circumstances. It wasn't the first time a mental health crisis had been mishandled. And it certainly wasn't the first time the department had faced allegations of mistreating people of color. Civil rights organizations pointed to Mitrice's case as emblematic of larger systemic problems in law enforcement's approach to mental health issues and in their treatment of black women in particular. They noted that black women who go missing often receive far less media attention and fewer investigative resources than white women, a disparity that had been well documented by researchers and advocates. The hashtag #SayHerName, which would later gain prominence in discussions of police violence against black women, was used by some activists in connection with Mitrice's case. They argued that Mitrice's name and story deserved to be remembered, that her death was part of a larger pattern of injustice, and that the systems that failed her needed to be fundamentally reformed. In 2011, the Los Angeles County Office of Independent Review, an oversight body that monitors the sheriff's department, released a scathing report on the handling of Mitrice's case. The report found that deputies had made significant errors in judgment, and that the decision to release Mitrice when and how they did was consistent with best practices and department policy. The report also criticized the initial missing persons investigation, finding that it had been insufficient and delayed. It noted that when Lattice Sutton first reported her daughter missing and explained the circumstances, the case should have immediately been treated as a high-priority emergency. Instead, crucial time was lost and the trail went cold, perhaps most damningly. The report found that there had been a lack of accountability within the department. Despite clear failures by multiple personnel, no one had been disciplined, no policies had been changed, and there was little evidence that the department had learned anything from the tragedy. The report made several recommendations, including better training for deputies in mental health crisis intervention, clearer policies about releasing individuals who appear to be in crisis, improved protocols for missing persons investigations, and greater accountability for deputies who make poor decisions. The sheriff's department publicly accepted the recommendations and promised to implement reforms. But for Lattice Sutton, these promises rang hollow. Her daughter was still dead. The people responsible for releasing her had faced no consequences, and the mystery of exactly what happened to Mitrice in her final hours remained unsolved. As the legal proceedings dragged on, Lattice became increasingly convinced that there was more to Mitrice's death than the sheriff's department was acknowledging. She believed that someone knew something they weren't telling, that evidence had been overlooked or suppressed, and that the truth was being deliberately obscured. Some of this conviction was based on specific evidence and inconsistencies in the official narrative, but some of it was based on a mother's intuition, on a sense that the pieces didn't fit together the way the authorities claimed they did. Lattice had raised Mitrice, had known her intimately, and couldn't shake the feeling that her daughter's final chapter had been more complex and darker than a simple case of getting lost in the wilderness. One particular aspect of the case that troubled Lattice was the question of where Mitrice had spent the hours between leaving the sheriff's station and being seen by Bill McCabe in Monte Nido. The two locations were 6 miles apart over extremely difficult terrain. Even in daylight, An experienced hiker would take several hours to cover that distance through the mountains. How had Mitris done it in the dark, in a state of mental confusion? The sheriff's department theorized that Mitris had followed roads, rather than cutting directly through the wilderness. But the road route from Lost Hill Station to Monte Nido was even longer, more than 10 miles, and would have taken many hours to walk. If Mitris had left the station at Tuala, Fairman was seen in Monte Nido at 6:00 or 7:00 a.m. That gave her only about 6 to 7 hours. Could she have walked 10+ miles on roads in that time? Possibly. But it seemed unlikely given her mental state, and the fact that no other witnesses reported seeing her on the roads during those hours. This led to the persistent theory that someone had given Mitris a ride at some point during that time period. Perhaps she had been picked up by a passing motorist shortly after leaving the station. Perhaps this person had driven her to the Monte Nido area, either with good intentions gone wrong or with malicious intent from the start. But if someone had picked her up, why hadn't they come forward? If it was an innocent Good Samaritan who had simply given her a ride, why wouldn't they report this to police, especially after Mitris's disappearance became major news? The lack of anyone coming forward with such information suggested either that no such ride occurred, or that whoever picked Mitris had a reason to remain silent. Some theories suggested that Mitris might have been picked up by someone from the sheriff's department, either a deputy or someone connected to the department. This would explain why the person hadn't come forward, and might explain why the investigation seemed to have blind spots. But there was no evidence to support this theory beyond speculation and distrust of the department. Lattice and her attorneys explored every possible lead, no matter how tenuous. They hired private investigators to re-interview witnesses, to search areas that might have been missed, to dig into the backgrounds of anyone who might have had contact with Mitris that night. They offered rewards for information leading to answers about what happened. They held press conferences pleading for anyone with knowledge to come forward. Some tips came in, but most led nowhere. People reported seeing Mitris in various locations, but when investigated, these sightings couldn't be confirmed or turned out to be cases of mistaken identity. Others called with theories and speculation, but without evidence to back them up. A few calls were from people seeking the reward money, with fabricated stories that quickly fell apart under scrutiny. In 2012, nearly 3 years after Mitris's death, there was a development that initially seemed promising, but ultimately added more confusion to the case. A man who lived in the Monte Nido area came forward claiming that he had found some of Mitris's clothing on his property months before her body was discovered. According to this man, whose name was redacted in court documents, he had found women's clothing including pants and a shirt in a remote area of his property in late 2009 or early 2010. He hadn't much of it at the time, assuming it was trash that had been dumped or belongings left behind by transients. He had thrown the items away without examining them closely. When he later learned about Mitris's case, and the fact that her body had been found nude, he made the connection and wondered if the clothing he'd found might have been hers. He reported this to the sheriff's department, but by then the clothing was long gone, disposed of months earlier, without the actual items to test for DNA or other evidence. There was no way to confirm whether they had belonged to Mitris. This account, if true, suggested that Mitris had removed or lost her clothing somewhere on this man's property, which was in the general vicinity of where her body was eventually found. But why would she have removed her clothing there? And why would her body be found in a different location? The sheriff's department investigated this claim but couldn't verify it. The man couldn't provide any proof that he had actually found clothing, and his timeline was vague. Some investigators suspected he might have fabricated the story, perhaps seeking attention or hoping to be seen as helpful. Others thought he might be misremembering finding some other clothing at some other time and retroactively associating it with Mitris's case. But Lattice's attorneys saw it differently. They believed this man might have actually found Mitris's clothing, which would support their theory that something more complex had happened to Mitris than the official narrative suggested. The fact that the clothing had been destroyed before it could be examined seemed suspicious to them, Another example: evidence being lost or overlooked. Throughout 2012 and 2013, the civil lawsuit continued its slow progression through the courts. Depositions were taken. Documents were produced, motions were filed and argued. The legal process was grinding and exhausting for everyone involved, but Lattice remained committed to seeing it through. The case was complicated by the fact that it involved multiple defendants with different levels of involvement and potentially different levels of culpability. Deputy Farag, who had arrested Mitris, argued that he had acted reasonably given the information he had at the time. The deputies who had released Mitris claimed they had followed protocols and couldn't have predicted what would happen. The sheriff's department as an institution argued that while mistakes might have been made, they didn't rise to the level of constitutional violations or gross negligence that would justify significant damages. Lattice's attorneys had to prove not just that the defendants had made poor decisions, but that those decisions violated Mitris's constitutional rights and directly caused her death. This was a high legal bar, and both sides knew it. The defense was betting that even if a jury felt sympathy for Lattice and anger at the sheriff's department, they wouldn't be able to find the specific legal violations necessary to award damages. As the case moved toward a potential trial date, there was increasing pressure on both sides to settle. Trials are expensive, time-consuming, and unpredictable. The county faced the risk of a massive verdict if a jury sided strongly with Lattice, but they also had good arguments that might lead to a defense verdict or minimal damages. Lattice faced the risk of going through a grueling trial and potentially walking away with nothing if the jury didn't find in her favor. Settlement negotiations began in earnest in late 2013. The county made offers that Lattice and her attorneys considered insultingly low, amounts that seemed designed to make the case go away cheaply, rather than to acknowledge any real wrongdoing. Lattice rejected these offers, making clear that she wasn't interested in a quick payoff. She wanted an amount that reflected the value of her daughter's life and the severity of what had been done to her. The negotiations were contentious and emotional. At one point, Lattice walked out of a mediation session, telling her attorneys she would rather take her chances at trial than accept what she saw as blood money that came with no admission of responsibility. Her attorneys counseled patience, explaining that settlements rarely included admissions of wrongdoing, and that a trial carried significant risks. But something else was motivating Lattice beyond money or even justice in the traditional sense. She wanted the truth. She wanted to know exactly what happened to Mitris in those final hours. She wanted to understand how her daughter had gone from being a bright college graduate with her whole life ahead of her to a set of scattered remains in a canyon. And she wasn't convinced that the sheriff's department had told her everything they knew. In early 2014, Lattice and her attorneys made a strategic decision. They would agree to settlement discussions, but only if the county would agree to release all documents related to Mitris's case and to allow independent investigators to review the evidence. They wanted transparency, even if they couldn't get a public admission of wrongdoing. The county balked at this request initially. Releasing all documents would expose internal communications and investigative files that the sheriff's department preferred to keep confidential. But Lattice's attorneys made clear that without this transparency, there would be no settlement, and the case would go to trial where even more damaging information might become public. After weeks of back and forth, a compromise was reached. The county would release a significant portion of the documents, with some redactions for privacy and ongoing investigation purposes. They would allow a mutually agreed upon expert to review certain evidence, and they would agree to a substantial financial settlement. In April 2014, Lattice Sutton and Los Angeles County reached a settlement in the wrongful death lawsuit. The county agreed to pay $900,000 to Lattice. This was far less than the millions Lattice's attorneys had initially sought, but it was enough to represent a significant admission that mistakes had been made. Even if that admission wasn't explicitly stated, the settlement agreement included several non-monetary provisions. The sheriff's department agreed to implement new training protocols for deputies on mental health crisis intervention. They agreed to revise their policies on releasing individuals who appeared to be in crisis. They agreed to improve their missing persons investigation procedures, and they agreed to release a substantial amount of documentation related to Mitrice's case. For Lattis, the money was almost beside the point. What mattered was that the county had acknowledged, at least implicitly, that their actions had contributed to Mitrice's death. What mattered was that changes would be made, so that hopefully no other family would through what she had gone through. But the settlement also meant that many questions would never be fully answered in a court of law. There would be no trial where witnesses would be cross-examined under oath. There would be no jury verdict assigning fault and responsibility. The settlement agreement included a clause stating that it did not constitute an admission of liability by the county, which meant the sheriff's department could continue to maintain that they had done nothing legally wrong. When the settlement was announced, public reaction was mixed. Some saw it as a victory for Lattis and for accountability, proof that even powerful institutions like the sheriff's department could be held responsible for their actions. Others saw it as a hollow victory, a relatively small payout that allowed the county to avoid the consequences of a trial and to move on without anyone being truly held accountable. Sheriff Lee Baca, who had overseen the department during Mitrice's case, had resigned in 2014 amid a separate corruption scandal involving jail abuses and obstruction of federal investigations. His resignation came before the Mitrice-Richardson settlement was finalized, allowing him to avoid having to answer for his department's handling of the case. Jim McDonnell, who succeeded Baca as sheriff, made public statements expressing regret about what happened to Mitrice and committing to implementing the reforms agreed to in the settlement. He said the department had learned from its mistakes and was committed to doing better. But for those who had followed the case closely, these words felt inadequate given the magnitude of what had happened. The documents released as part of the settlement shed new light on some aspects of the case, but they also raised new questions. Internal Sheriff's Department communications showed that some personnel had expressed concerns about how the case was being handled even in the early days of the investigation. There were emails suggesting that supervisors were aware of problems with the initial search but had chosen to minimize them publicly. Some communications suggested that there had been disagreements within the department about whether Mitrice's case should be classified as a missing person case, or whether she should simply be considered a voluntary missing adult who would turn up eventually. This classification mattered because it affected the resources devoted to searching for her. There were also communications suggesting that the department had been concerned about liability from the moment they learned Mitrice was missing. Legal advisors within the county had been consulted early on about potential exposure, and there appeared to be an effort to craft public statements carefully to minimize omission of any wrongdoing. The released documents also included detailed reports from the searches that had been conducted in the weeks after Mitrice disappeared. These reports painted a picture of a search operation that had been hampered by poor coordination, inadequate resources, and conflicting priorities. Different agencies had been involved: Sheriff's Department personnel, volunteer search and rescue teams, and private search groups hired by the family, but there had been little effective coordination between them. Maps included in the documents showed the areas that had supposedly been searched, but when these maps were compared with the location where Mitrice's body was eventually found, troubling discrepancies emerged. Some areas marked as searched on the maps were hundreds of yards away from where she was actually found. Other areas showed overlapping search patterns that suggested the same ground had been covered multiple times, while adjacent areas were missed entirely. One particularly damning document was an internal memo written by a search and rescue coordinator, expressing frustration with the resources being allocated to the search. The coordinator had requested additional personnel, specialized equipment, and more time to conduct a thorough search of the rugged terrain. The request had been denied, with a supervisor noting that the case didn't warrant such extensive resources given that Mitrice was an adult who left voluntarily. This notation revealed a fundamental misunderstanding, or willful ignorance of Mitrice's situation. Yes, she was technically an adult who had walked out of the station voluntarily. but she was an adult in the midst of a clear mental health crisis, released without resources in a dangerous area in the middle of the night. Treating her disappearance as simply a voluntary missing person case, rather than an emergency situation, had directly contributed to the inadequate search response. Lattice Sutton read through the documents with a mixture of vindication and heartbreak. On one hand, they confirmed what she had suspected all along, that the sheriff's department had failed her daughter through a combination of negligence, poor judgment, and systemic indifference. On the other hand, seeing it documented in black and white, reading the callous dismissal of her daughter's life in bureaucratic memos, was almost unbearable. One document that particularly haunted Lattice was the transcript of the 9/11 call from Joffrey's restaurant on the night Mitris was arrested. The restaurant manager who called had explicitly told the dispatcher that they had a customer who was acting very strange and talking about religious stuff, and doesn't seem to be in her right mind. The dispatcher had relayed this information to the deputies who responded. So the deputies who arrested Mitris knew, before they even arrived, that they were dealing with someone who might be experiencing a mental health crisis. Yet they had still arrested her rather than getting her help. They had still taken her to jail rather than to a hospital. They had still released her into danger rather than ensuring she had a safe way home. Every decision point along the way, they had chosen the path that led to Mitris's death. Among the released documents were also the full autopsy reports and forensic analyses that had been conducted. While the official cause of death remained undetermined, the detailed reports contained additional information that had not been made public previously. The forensic anthropologist who examined Mitris's skeletal remains noted that while there were no obvious signs of trauma, the condition of the remains made it impossible to rule out soft tissue injuries that would have left no marks on bone. Strangulation, suffocation, or blows to soft tissue areas could have killed Mitris without leaving skeletal evidence. The toxicology report was inconclusive due to the decomposition, but it did note the absence of certain markers that might have been expected if Mitris had been under the influence of hard drugs, which some had speculated might explain her behavior. The small amount of marijuana found in her car was not sufficient to explain the level of mental disorientation she had exhibited. A soil analysis from the location where Mitris's remains were found showed that the body had been there for an extended period, consistent with her having died shortly after her disappearance, rather than surviving for weeks or months. This was based on the degree of decomposition and the patterns of vegetation growth and disturbance around the remains. But one detail in the forensic reports caught the attention of Lattice's legal team and independent experts they consulted. The distribution pattern of Mitris's remains was unusual. While animal scattering of remains is common and can spread bones across a significant area, the specific pattern in Mitris's case didn't entirely match what would typically be expected from natural scavenging. Some bones were found in locations that suggested they might have been moved or repositioned. The skull, for instance, was partially buried in creek sediment in a way that seemed inconsistent with natural settling. Some smaller bones were found at distances from the main concentration of remains that exceeded what would normally result from animal activity. These observations led some experts to suggest, cautiously, given the limited evidence, that Mitris's body might have been moved or disturbed by human activity at some point, either shortly after death or at some later time. This could have been innocent, someone stumbling upon the remains and panicking, disturbing them before fleeing, or it could suggest something more sinister. The sheriff's department's forensic experts dismissed these concerns, arguing that the bone distribution was entirely consistent with 11 months of exposure to weather, water flow in the creek bed, and animal activity. They pointed out that coyotes, ravens, and other scavengers in the area were perfectly capable of moving bones significant distances, and that water runoff during rainy season could also redistribute remains. But the question lingered, another piece of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. Another reason for Lattice and others to wonder whether the full truth had been uncovered. In the years following the settlement, Lattice Sutton became an advocate for mental health awareness and criminal justice reform. She channeled her grief and anger into action, working with organizations that sought to change how law enforcement responds to mental health crises. She spoke at conferences and community meetings, sharing Mitress's story and calling for systemic change. Lattice pushed for the adoption of crisis intervention team training for law enforcement officers, a program that teaches police how to recognize and appropriately respond to mental health emergencies. She advocated for the creation of specialized mental health response teams that could be dispatched instead of armed officers when someone was in psychiatric crisis. She supported legislation that would require law enforcement agencies to have clear protocols for handling situations like Mitress's. Some of these efforts bore fruit. Several California jurisdictions expanded their CI training programs, citing Mitress's case as an example of why such training was necessary. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, under pressure from the settlement and public scrutiny, did implement new training and policies, though whether these changes were substantive or cosmetic remained a matter of debate. Lattice also became involved in advocacy around missing persons cases, particularly missing Black women and girls. She worked with organizations like the Black and Missing Foundation to raise awareness about the disparities in media coverage and investigative resources devoted to missing persons cases depending on the race and socioeconomic status of the victim. Mitress's case became a rallying point for these advocates. Here was a young Black woman with a college degree, from a loving family, whose disappearance and death had been mishandled by authorities in ways that seemed unthinkable if she had been a young woman from a wealthy family. The contrast between the resources devoted to some missing persons cases and the inadequate response to Mitress's disappearance highlighted systemic inequities that activists had long been fighting against. But even as Lattice threw herself into advocacy work, she never stopped searching for answers about exactly what happened to her daughter. She continued to receive tips and leads years after Mitress's death, some credible and some not. She continued to wonder whether there were witnesses who hadn't come forward, whether there was evidence that hadn't been examined, whether someone out there knew the truth and was keeping silent. One persistent question that haunted Lattice was about Mitress's mental state in the weeks before her death. Lattice knew her daughter had been going through something, that Mitress's behavior had changed, that she seemed to be experiencing some kind of psychological crisis. But Lattice had never gotten a clear diagnosis or understanding of what exactly Mitress was experiencing. After Mitress's death, Lattice consulted with mental health professionals, showing them videos of Mitress, sharing her observations of her daughter's behavior, asking what might have been wrong. The consensus among these experts was that Mitress had likely been experiencing the first episode of a serious mental illness, possibly bipolar disorder with psychotic features or possibly early-stage schizophrenia. These are illnesses that often first meet adolescence or early adulthood, right around Mitress's age. They can develop rapidly, with symptoms emerging over weeks or months. The symptoms Lattice described, rapid speech, grandiose thinking, disconnected ideas, reduced need for sleep, increasingly erratic behavior, were all consistent with a manic episode or psychotic break. What made this particularly tragic was that these illnesses are treatable. With proper diagnosis and treatment, medication, therapy, support, many people with bipolar disorder or schizophrenia live full, productive lives. But Mitress never got that treatment. Instead, when she was clearly in crisis, the system treated her as a criminal rather than a patient. She was arrested instead of hospitalized, jailed instead of cared for, and ultimately released to die alone in the wilderness. This realization, that her daughter's death might have been entirely preventable with appropriate mental health intervention, was almost more than Lattice could bear. It represented not just a failure of the sheriff's department on one particular night, but a failure of the entire system to recognize and respond appropriately to mental illness, especially in communities of color where mental health issues have historically been stigmatized and undertreated. Lattice began speaking openly about mental health in the Black community, trying to reduce stigma and encourage people to seek help. She talked about the signs she had missed or dismissed in Mitress's behavior, the red flags that in hindsight seemed obvious but that she hadn't fully recognized at the time. She encouraged other parents to be vigilant, to take mental health seriously, to not be afraid or ashamed to get their children help. This advocacy work gave Lettuce a sense of purpose, a way to make meaning from Mitris's death, but it didn't fill the void left by her daughter's absence. Every birthday Mitris didn't celebrate, every milestone she didn't reach, every moment that should have been shared between mother and daughter was a fresh wound. Lettuce visited the site where Mitris's body had been found, a difficult journey both physically and emotionally. The area was remote and required hiking in from the nearest road. Standing in that canyon, looking at the place where her daughter had taken her last breath, Lettuce tried to imagine what Mitris's final hours had been like. Had she been frightened? Had she been in pain? Had she known she was dying, or had the mental confusion that plagued her in those final days protected her from that awareness? Had she thought about her mother, about home, about all the dreams and plans that would never come to fruition? These were questions without answers, and Lettuce knew she would carry them for the rest of her life. The unknowing was its own form of torture, an endless loop of speculation and imagination about those dark hours that no one would ever be able to fully reconstruct. As the years passed, the media attention to Mitris's case waxed and waned. There would be renewed interest on anniversaries of her disappearance or death, with retrospective articles examining what had happened and what had changed or not changed since then. Documentaries and true crime programs occasionally featured Mitris's case, introducing her story to new audiences. Some of this coverage was respectful and thoughtful, treating Mitris as a full human being rather than just a tragic victim. These pieces explored her life, her dreams, her personality, and the systemic failures that led to her death. They interviewed Lettuce and others who knew Mitris, painting a picture of a vibrant young woman whose potential had been stolen. Other coverage was more exploitative, focusing on the sensational aspects of the case, the mysterious disappearance, the conspiracy theories, the institutional failures, without fully honoring Mitris's humanity. Lettuce found these pieces difficult to watch or read. They reduced her daughter to a story, a mystery to be solved, rather than a person who had been loved and was desperately missed. In 2019, 10 years after Mitris's death, Lettuce organized a memorial event at a community center in Los Angeles. Friends, family, activists, and supporters gathered to remember Mitris and to recommit to the work of criminal justice reform and mental health advocacy that her case had inspired. People shared memories of Mitris, telling stories about her kindness, her intelligence, her creativity. They talked about her love of poetry and music, her philosophical nature, her dreams of making a difference in the world. For a few hours, Mitris was more than a victim or a cautionary tale. She was a daughter, a friend, a bright light that had been extinguished too soon. Lettuce spoke at the event, her voice strong despite the emotion behind it. She talked about the progress that had been made in the decades since Mitris's death, the training programs implemented, the policies changed. The conversation started about mental health and policing. But she also talked about how much work remained to be done, how many families were still going through what she had gone through, how many people in mental health crisis were still being failed by systems that should protect them. Mitris should be here today, Lettuce said. She should be 34 years old. She should be living her life, maybe with a family of her own, maybe working as a therapist helping others, maybe writing poetry or traveling the world, or doing any of the 1,000 things she dreamed about. But she's not here because too many people failed her. And until we fix these systems, until we value every life equally, until we treat mental illness with the same urgency and compassion we'd give to any other health crisis, there will be more Mitrises. And that's unacceptable. The speech was met with applause and tears. Lettuce had articulated what everyone in the room felt: grief for what was lost, anger at the injustice, and determination to ensure that Mitris's death meant something, that it led to change. But privately, Lettuce still grappled with questions that all her advocacy couldn't answer. She still wondered about those final hours, still questioned whether there was more to the story than what had been revealed, still felt in her bones that something about the official narrative didn't add up. There were nights when Lattice would lie awake, going over every detail of the case in her mind. She would think about the witnesses who claimed to have seen Mitrice in various locations. She would think about the missing clothing, the suspicious timing of certain events, the inconsistencies in the sheriff's department's account. She would wonder whether someone out there knew something they weren't saying, whether there was evidence that had been overlooked or destroyed, whether justice for Mitrice would ever truly be achieved. Some people told Lattice she needed to let go, to make peace with what happened and move on with her life. They meant well, but they didn't understand. You don't let go of your child. You don't make peace with a preventable death. You carry it with you every day for the rest of your life. Lattice found some solace in her faith. She believed that Mitrice was at peace now, free from whatever mental anguish had plagued her in those final weeks. She believed that there was a larger justice beyond the imperfect justice of human courts, that those who had failed Mitrice would ultimately answer for their actions even if they never faced earthly consequences. But faith didn't erase the questions. It didn't fill in the gaps in the timeline. It didn't explain how a 24-year-old woman had vanished so completely that her body lay undiscovered for 11 millennia that should have been thoroughly searched. In 2020, the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors, responding to renewed calls for police reform in the wake of George Floyd's murder and the subsequent protests, launched a new review of the Sheriff's Department's policies and practices. Mitrice Richardson's case was cited as one example of past failures that needed to be addressed. The review resulted in new recommendations, some of which echoed the reforms that had supposedly been implemented after the 2014 settlement. This repetition, the cycle of tragedy, outrage, promised reform, and then more tragedy, was disheartening to Lattice and others who had been fighting for change. How many times did the same lessons need to be learned? How many people had to die before the system actually changed in meaningful ways? These questions plagued advocates who saw Mitrice's case not as an isolated incident, but as part of a pattern of systemic dysfunction. The Sheriff's Department, meanwhile, continued to maintain that while mistakes had been made in Mitrice's case, they had learned from them and implemented significant changes. They pointed to statistics showing increased use of mental health holds instead of arrests for people in crisis. They highlighted their expanded crisis intervention team training program. They noted partnerships with mental health organizations to provide better support for people with psychiatric issues. But critics argued that these changes were often more form than substance, that the underlying culture within the department hadn't really shifted, and that the same kinds of failures continued to happen even if they didn't always result in deaths as high profile as Mitrice's. As of 2024, 15 years after Mitrice Richardson's death, her case remains officially closed but unresolved in the hearts and minds of many who followed it. The Sheriff's Department maintains that Mitrice died of exposure after wandering into the wilderness following her release from custody, a tragic accident resulting from poor judgment but not criminal conduct. Lattice Sutton and others believe the truth is more complex and possibly darker, that there are still unanswered questions about what happened to Mitrice in her final hours, and that someone, somewhere knows more than they've admitted. The physical evidence is long gone. Mitrice's remains were cremated after the autopsy. The scene where she was found has been reclaimed by nature, and any trace evidence that might have existed has been lost to time and the elements. Without new witnesses coming forward or new evidence emerging, the gaps in the narrative will likely never be filled. But Mitrice's legacy lives on in the advocacy work her death inspired, in the policy changes that bear her name, in the conversations about mental health and policing that her case helped to catalyze. She is remembered not just as a victim but as a catalyst for change, a young woman whose death exposed systemic failures and sparked demands for reform. Lattice continues to share Mitrice's story whenever she's asked, to new audiences and new generations of activists. She keeps her daughter's memory alive through the Mitrice Richardson Foundation, which provides support to families of missing persons and advocates for better mental health services in underserved communities. Every September 17th, On the anniversary of the night Mitrice walked out of the Lost Hills Sheriff Station and into the darkness, Gladys observes a private moment of remembrance. She looks at photos of Mitrice as a child, as a teenager, as the bright college graduate full of hope and promise. She reads from Mitrice's journals, those philosophical musings and poetic expressions that captured her daughter's beautiful, complex mind, and she makes the same promise she made when she buried Mitrice, that she will never stop fighting for answers, never stop working for change, never stop saying her daughter's name and telling her story. Because Mitrice Richardson deserved better than what she got from the systems that should have protected her. She deserved to live, to thrive, to become whoever she was meant to be. That opportunity was stolen from her on a September night in 2009. And while the specific circumstances of how she died may never be fully known, the failures that led to her death are clear and documented. Multiple people had opportunities to help Mitrice and didn't. Multiple systems failed her at critical moments, and those failures cost Mitrice her life. The question that haunts everyone who knows Mitrice's story is simple and impossible: what if? What if the deputies at Joffrey's had taken Mitrice to a hospital instead of jail? What if the personnel at Lost Hills Station had held her until morning, or called her mother to pick her up? What if the initial search had been conducted with the urgency and resources her case deserved? What if someone who saw her wandering in Monte Nido that morning had stopped to help? Any one of these what-ifs could have changed everything. Mitrice could still be alive. She could be living the life she dreamed about, making the difference in the world she'd hoped to make. Instead, she's a name on a list of preventable tragedies, a cautionary tale about what happens when systems fail vulnerable people. Gladys Sutton will carry these what-ifs for the rest of her life. They're heavy, painful, and impossible to put down. But she's learned to carry them alongside something else: a determination that Mitrice's death will mean something, that it will lead to change, that other mothers won't have to go through what she went through. The investigation into Mitrice Richardson's death, while officially closed, left behind a trail of unanswered questions that continued to trouble not just her family, but also independent investigators, journalists, and members of the public who couldn't accept the official narrative at face value. Over the years, various individuals and organizations conducted their own investigations, trying to piece together what really happened in those crucial hours between Mitrice's release from custody and her death. One of the most thorough independent investigations was conducted by a team of investigative journalists in 2016, 7 years after Mitrice's death. They obtained copies of all the public records related to the case, interviewed dozens of witnesses, consulted with forensic experts, and even conducted their own searches of the area where Mitrice was found. Their findings, published as a multi-part series, raised troubling questions about the official account. The journalists focused particularly on the timeline and geography of Mitrice's movements, using GPS mapping and actual physical retracing of possible routes. They attempted to determine how feasible it was for Mitrice to have traveled from Lost Hills Station to Dark Canyon on foot in the time frame suggested by the official account. What they found was disturbing. The direct route through the wilderness was extremely difficult terrain, involving steep climbs, dense vegetation, and multiple obstacles that would be nearly impossible to navigate in the dark without proper equipment and knowledge of the area. Even experienced hikers familiar with the terrain estimated it would take 6 to 8 hours in daylight to cover that route. At night, in a state of mental confusion, it seemed virtually impossible. The alternative route following roads was longer, approximately 10 to 12 miles, but would have been more navigable, however. This route would have taken Mitrice along Malibu Canyon Road and other relatively busy streets, where she almost certainly would have been seen by other drivers. The fact that only 1 or 2 possible sightings were reported seemed inconsistent with her walking that route for hours. The journalists proposed several alternative scenarios. One was that Mitrice had been picked up by someone shortly after leaving the sheriff's station, driven to the Monte Nido area where Bill McCabe saw her, and then either abandoned there or worse. This would explain both the timing and the unlikely location where she ended up. Another scenario they explored was that Mitrice might have sought shelter at one of the properties in the Monte Nido area and encountered someone who, for whatever reason, harmed her or caused her death, then moved her body to the canyon where it was eventually found. This would explain the absence of her clothing, the strange distribution of her remains, and the failure of initial search efforts to locate her. A third scenario, more disturbing still, suggested that Mitrice might have died at or near the sheriff's station, and that her body had been moved to Dark Canyon to cover up what had happened. This theory was based largely on circumstantial evidence and suspicion rather than hard facts, but the journalists noted several inconsistencies that could support it. The convenient failure of certain security cameras at the station, the incomplete documentation of her release, and the seeming lack of urgency in the initial search. The sheriff's department dismissed all of these alternative scenarios as conspiracy theories unsupported by evidence. They maintained that the most straightforward explanation, that Mitrice had walked into the wilderness and died of exposure, was the correct one, and that attempts to complicate the narrative were driven more by distrust of law enforcement than by actual facts. But the journalists' investigation did uncover some new information that hadn't been widely reported before. They interviewed several residents of the Monte Nido area who claimed to have seen or heard unusual activity on the night of September 17, 2009, or in the days immediately following. One resident, whose property was near where Mitrice's body was eventually found, reported that her dogs had been unusually agitated on the night of September 17, barking frantically at something in the direction of the canyon. She had assumed it was a coyote or other wildlife and hadn't investigated. Looking back, she wondered if the dogs had sensed Mitrice's presence. Another resident reported seeing what looked like a sheriff's department vehicle in an unusual location near Dark Canyon in the early morning hours of September 17. The resident hadn't thought much of it at the time. Sheriff's vehicles patrolled the area regularly, but the timing and location seemed potentially significant in hindsight. However, this resident couldn't be certain of the exact date or time, and there were no records of any sheriff's department activity in that specific area at that time. These accounts were intriguing but ultimately inconclusive. They added pieces to the puzzle without necessarily making the picture any clearer. And without harder evidence, photographs, videos, or multiple corroborating witnesses, they remained in the realm of interesting possibilities rather than proven facts. The journalists also uncovered information about other incidents at the Lost Hills Sheriff's Station that suggested a pattern of questionable judgment and possible misconduct. They found several other cases where individuals had been released from the station in circumstances that raised safety concerns, though none had ended as tragically as Mitrice's. There was the case of an elderly man with apparent dementia who had been released late at night and had to be rescued by a passing motorist after wandering onto a busy highway. There was a young woman who had been released without her shoes or jacket and had suffered frostbite walking to safety. There were multiple instances of people in apparent mental health crisis being jailed rather than hospitalized, though most of these individuals had ultimately made it home safely. These cases suggested that the failures in Mitrice's case weren't isolated incidents, but rather reflected systemic problems in how the Lost Hills Station handled vulnerable individuals. The journalists' reporting put additional pressure on the sheriff's department to demonstrate that they had truly reformed their practices. Beyond the journalistic investigations, there were also independent researchers and true crime enthusiasts who became fascinated by Mitrice's case and conducted their own inquiries. Some of these were thoughtful and respectful, genuinely trying to understand what happened. Others veered into wild speculation and conspiracy theorizing that did more harm than good. One persistent theory that circulated online was that Mitrice had been killed as part of some kind of ritualistic murder, or had stumbled into something she shouldn't have seen in the wealthy, secluded Monte Nido area. These theories often pointed to the fact that several prominent and wealthy individuals had properties in the area, suggesting without evidence that one of them might have been involved in Mitrice's death, and that the sheriff's department was covering it up. These theories were fueled partly by the known fact that some wealthy and powerful people had received preferential treatment from the sheriff's department in various contexts. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department had a history of scandals involving favors for celebrities and wealthy donors. So the idea that such a person might receive protection if they were involved in a crime wasn't entirely far-fetched. However, there was no actual evidence linking any specific individual to Matrice's death, and these theories often relied on leaps of logic and assumptions that couldn't be verified. Lattice Sutton herself tried to distance herself from the more outlandish conspiracy theories, recognizing that they could undermine the legitimate questions about the case. What Lattice did support were efforts to get additional official investigations into the case. In 2017, she petitioned the California Attorney General's office to conduct an independent review of the Sheriff's Department's handling of Matrice's case. She argued that the department couldn't be trusted to investigate itself, and that an outside authority was needed to determine whether any laws had been broken. The Attorney General's office initially declined to open an investigation, stating that the case had been thoroughly investigated, and that there was no new evidence to warrant reopening it. But after sustained pressure from Lattice, civil rights organizations, and sympathetic lawmakers, they agreed to conduct a review of the case. This review, completed in 2018, confirmed many of the criticisms that had been leveled at the Sheriff's Department. The Attorney General's office found that the decision to release Matrice when and how they did was inconsistent with best practices and sound judgment. They found that the initial missing persons investigation was inadequate and reflected poor prioritization. And they found that the search operations had been hampered by insufficient resources and coordination issues. However, the review stopped short of finding any criminal wrongdoing. The Attorney General's office concluded that while the deputies involved had made poor decisions, those decisions didn't rise to the level of criminal negligence or civil rights violations that could be prosecuted. The statute of limitation for any potential charges had also long since passed. For Lattice, this was a hollow victory. It was vindicating to have an official authority confirm what she'd been saying all along, that the Sheriff's Department had failed her daughter. But without criminal accountability, without anyone facing consequences for those failures, it felt like just more words on paper. The Attorney General's report did make several recommendations, including that the Sheriff's Department implement mandatory mental health crisis intervention training for all deputies, that they revise their policies on releasing individuals who appear to be in crisis, and that they improve coordination between different units when conducting missing persons investigations. By 2018, some of these reforms had supposedly already been implemented following the 2014 settlement. The fact that the Attorney General was recommending them again suggested that either they hadn't been fully implemented or they hadn't been effective. This pattern tragedy, outrage, recommendations, inadequate implementation repeat was depressingly familiar to those who had been fighting for police reform for years. Meanwhile, the toll that Matrice's case had taken on those directly involved became increasingly apparent over time. Deputy Tariq Farag, who had arrested Matrice, reportedly struggled with the aftermath of the case. While he maintained publicly that he had acted appropriately, sources close to him suggested that he was haunted by what had happened, and by the role he'd played in it. Farag eventually left the Sheriff's Department, though whether this was voluntary or the result of pressure related to the Matrice Ritson case was never entirely clear. He largely disappeared from public view, declining interview requests and staying out of the spotlight. For someone who had been thrust into the center of a high-profile controversy, he seemed eager to move on and put the case behind him. Other deputies who had been present the night Matrice was released faced varying degrees of scrutiny and personal impact. Some remained with the department and went on to have successful careers, apparently suffering no long-term consequences for their involvement in the case. Others left law enforcement entirely, whether due to the Matrice Richardson case or for unrelated reasons. The staff at Joffrey's restaurant, where Matrice's troubles began that night, also struggled with the aftermath. The restaurant manager who had called 911 reportedly felt tremendous guilt about having involved the police, wondering whether Mitrice might still be alive if she'd simply been allowed to leave the restaurant without law enforcement intervention. Of course, this wasn't a reasonable burden for the restaurant staff to carry. They had been faced with an unusual and difficult situation, and had made what seemed like a reasonable decision at the time. The failure wasn't theirs, it was the failure of the system that responded to their call for help. But guilt doesn't always follow logical lines. The manager apparently left Joffrey's not long after Mitrice's case became widely publicized, and the restaurant itself faced some criticism and protests from activists who felt that calling the police on a black woman in mental crisis was itself a problematic act that contributed to her death. This raised difficult questions about how restaurant staff and other members of the public should respond when they encounter someone who appears to be in crisis. Should they call the police? Should they try to help themselves? Should they call a mental health crisis line if one exists? There are no easy answers, especially given that police responses to mental health crises have so often ended in tragedy. Bill McCabe, the Monte resident who saw Mitrice the morning after her release, was also profoundly affected by his role in the story. His decision not to approach Mitrice or offer help haunted him. In interviews, he expressed deep regret and wondered aloud how different things might have been if he'd simply asked if she needed assistance or called someone to help her. But again, it's easy to judge decisions in hindsight that seemed less clear in the moment. McCabe had seen a stranger in his neighborhood acting oddly. He didn't know she was a missing person in crisis. He didn't know she desperately needed help. He just saw someone who made him uncomfortable, and he made the all-too-human decision to mind his own business and avoid getting involved. The tragedy is that this same decision, not to get involved, not to help a stranger who seems to be in distress, is made countless times every day by countless people. Usually, nothing terrible comes of it. But sometimes, as in Mitrice's case, that decision not to help has catastrophic consequences. Mitrice's case became a touchstone for conversations about social responsibility and community care. What obligations do we have to help strangers, especially those who appear to be in crisis? How do we overcome the barriers, fear, uncertainty, social awkwardness, distrust, that prevent us from offering help to those who need it? These aren't just abstract philosophical questions. They have real-world implications. If more people felt empowered and obligated to help those in crisis, if there were clearer pathways for getting people the help they need without involving armed police officers, if communities took more collective responsibility for the vulnerable among them, perhaps tragedies like Mitrice's could be prevented. Some communities have experimented with alternative crisis response systems that don't rely primarily on police. These might involve teams of mental health professionals and paramedics who respond to mental health crises, or community-based support networks that provide assistance to people experiencing homelessness or mental illness. Early results from some of these programs have been promising, showing that they can reduce both harm to people in crisis and the burden on law enforcement. Advocates for these alternatives often point to Mitrice's case as an example of why they're needed. If Mitrice had been met with mental health professionals instead of armed deputies when the crisis at Joffrey's was reported, the entire trajectory of that would have been different. She would have been taken to a hospital instead of a jail. She would have received evaluation and treatment instead of being arrested and released. She might still be alive, but implementing these alternative systems requires resources, political will, and a fundamental shift in how we think about public safety and community care. It requires recognizing that not every problem should be solved by sending police, that mental health crises or medical issues require medical responses, and that prevention and treatment are more effective than punishment and abandonment. These are lessons that Mitrice's case teaches, if we're willing to learn them. But the question is whether those lessons will be truly absorbed and acted upon, or whether they'll be acknowledged in the immediate aftermath of tragedy and then forgotten as public attention moves on to the next crisis. Lattice Sutton has dedicated herself to ensuring that the lessons aren't forgotten, that Mitress's case continues to be remembered and used as a catalyst for change. She's partnered with mental health organizations, criminal justice reform groups, and civil rights advocates to push for systemic reforms. One initiative that Lettuce has been particularly involved in is the push for what's sometimes called Mitress's Law, legislation that would require law enforcement agencies to have clear protocols for handling individuals who appear to be in mental health crisis. Such a law would mandate that officers receive training in recognizing mental illness, require that individuals in crisis be connected with mental health services rather than jailed when possible, and prohibit the release of people in crisis without ensuring they have a safe way to access appropriate care. Versions of Mitress's Law have been proposed in California and other states, with varying degrees of success. Some provisions have been incorporated into broader criminal justice reform legislation. Others have stalled in committee or been watered down through the legislative process. The fight for comprehensive reform continues, with Mitress's story serving as a powerful example of why such reforms are necessary. Lettuce has also worked with organizations that support families of missing persons, providing resources and emotional support to those going through similar ordeals. She understands better than most the unique pain of not knowing what happened to a loved one, the agony of waiting for news, the frustration of dealing with inadequate or indifferent law enforcement responses. Through this work, Lettuce has connected with dozens of other families whose loved ones have disappeared under suspicious or unclear circumstances. She's learned that Mitress's case, while unique in its specific details, is part of a larger pattern of missing persons cases that don't receive adequate attention or resources, particularly when the missing person is Black, Indigenous, a person of color, LGBTQ, experiencing homelessness or dealing with mental illness. This recognition that Mitress's case is part of a broader systemic problem rather than an isolated tragedy has both deepened Lettuce's grief and strengthened her resolve. The problem is bigger than one sheriff's department or one bad night of decisions. It's embedded in how our society values different lives, how our systems respond to mental illness, how our institutions prioritize cases based on the race and class of the victims. Changing these deep-rooted patterns requires sustained effort over years and decades, not just moments of outrage followed by performative reforms. It requires shifting budgets, retraining personnel, redesigning systems, and most fundamentally, changing how we think about justice, safety, and community care. Lettuce knows she won't live to see all the changes she's fighting for fully realized. The work is too big, the obstacles too entrenched. But she finds purpose in knowing that she's contributing to a movement that's larger than herself, that the fight she's waging in Mitress's name is part of a long arc toward justice that many others are also pulling on. On difficult days, and there are many, Lettuce returns to Mitress's journals and writings, reading her daughter's words, seeing the evidence of her brilliant mind and beautiful spirit, reminds Lettuce of what was lost and why the fight matters. Mitress wrote about wanting to help people, about believing in the possibility of a better world, about seeing potential for growth and change even in difficult circumstances. In one journal entry written just weeks before her death, Mitress had written about the importance of speaking truth to power, of not being silent in the face of injustice, of believing that individual actions could contribute to collective change. Reading those words, Lettuce felt that her advocacy work was a way of honoring Mitress's values, of continuing the work her daughter might have done if she'd lived. There were also entries that broke Lettuce's heart, passages where Mitress wrote about feeling confused, overwhelmed by thoughts she couldn't quite control, sensing that something was wrong, but not knowing what or how to fix it. These entries, read with the knowledge of what would come, were almost unbearable. They showed a young woman struggling with something she didn't fully understand, reaching out for help in her own way, but not finding the support she needed. If only Mitress had been connected with mental health services earlier. If only the stigma around mental illness hadn't been so strong. If only there had been better resources for young Black women experiencing psychiatric crisis. If onlys could drive someone mad. And Lettuce had to be careful not to let them consume her. She couldn't change the past, couldn't bring Mitris back, couldn't undo any of the failures that led to her daughter's death. All she could do was work to change the future, to try to prevent other families from experiencing the same tragedy. As the 15th anniversary of Mitris's disappearance approached in 2024, Lattice began planning another memorial event. She wanted it to be different from previous memorials, not just a remembrance of Mitris's death, but a celebration of her life and a recommitment to the work her death had inspired. The event would feature speakers who had been working on mental health reform, criminal justice advocacy, and missing persons awareness. There would be art and music, including some of Mitris's own poetry set to music by local artists. There would be a call to action. Specific steps that attendees could take to contribute to the movements for change. Lattice also wanted to launch a scholarship in Mitris's name for students studying psychology or social work, fields that Mitris had been passionate about. The scholarship would prioritize students from underserved communities who were committed to working on mental health issues, carrying forward the work that Mitris had hoped to do. Planning the memorial was bittersweet. It meant acknowledging again that Mitris was gone, that 15 years had passed without her, that she would forever be 24 while Lattice continued to age. But it also meant keeping Mitris's memory alive, ensuring that her name and story continued to have power and meaning. The response to the announcement of the memorial and scholarship was overwhelming. Donations poured in from people who had followed Mitris's case, from organizations that had been inspired by her story, from strangers who were moved by the tragedy and wanted to contribute to something positive. Within weeks, enough money had been raised to fully fund the scholarship for its first several years. This outpouring of support reminded Lattice that she wasn't alone in this fight, that Mitris's story had touched countless people and motivated them to action. It was a small comfort in the face of immeasurable loss, but it was something. Mitris's life, though cut short, was still making a difference. Her death, though preventable and unjust, was still catalyzing change. As we reach the end of Mitris Richardson's story, we're left with more questions than answers. The official conclusion remains unchanged. Mitris died of undetermined causes after wandering into the Santa Monica Mountains, following her release from Lost Hills Sheriff Station. But the gaps in that narrative, the unanswered questions, and the systemic failures that led to her death continue to haunt everyone who knows her story. What we know for certain is this: Mitris Richardson was a brilliant, creative young woman with her whole life ahead of her. She was experiencing a mental health crisis that should have been met with compassion and professional care. Instead, she encountered a system that criminalized her illness, that valued procedure over humanity, that released her into danger, and then failed to find her when she disappeared. We know that multiple people had opportunities to save Mitris's life and didn't. Deputies who could have taken her to a hospital instead arrested her. Personnel who could have held her safely until morning instead pushed her out the door. Search teams who should have found her body in the first days instead let 11 months pass before she was discovered. We know that Lattice Sutton has spent 15 years fighting for justice for her daughter, fighting for answers, fighting to make sure no other family goes through what she went through. Her advocacy has led to real changes in policies and practices, though whether those changes go far enough remains an open question. We know that Mitris's case exposed deep problems in how our society handles mental illness, particularly in communities of color. It revealed the inadequacy of our crisis response systems, the failures of law enforcement to appropriately handle psychiatric emergencies, and the disparities in how missing persons cases are investigated and resourced. What we don't know, and may never know, is exactly what happened to Mitris in her final hours. We don't know how she traveled from Lost Hills Station to Dark Canyon. We don't know what her last thoughts were, whether she was frightened or at peace, whether she suffered or slipped away quietly. We don't know if she was truly alone or if someone else was involved in her death. These unknowns will likely remain mysteries forever. The physical evidence is gone. Key witnesses may never come forward. And the passage of time has made it increasingly unlikely that new information will emerge to solve the remaining puzzles. But perhaps the most important question isn't what happened to Mitris in those final hours. Perhaps the most important question is what we do with her story now. Do we learn from the failures that led to her death? Do we implement real reforms to prevent similar tragedies? Do we honor her memory by creating systems that value every life and treat mental illness with the compassion and urgency it deserves? Mitris Richardson deserved better than what she received from the systems that should have protected her. She deserved to live, to pursue her dreams, to make the difference in the world she'd hoped to make. That opportunity was stolen from her. Thank you for listening. If you enjoy this case, leave a comment and subscribe. Good night and stay safe.